So good morning and welcome back. We're heading now for our first paper session. And I would also like to start by thanking the organizing committee, thanking specifically to Sandra Vieira Jurgens, who for having invited me to moderate this session. It's a pleasure to participate in this debate. But I would also like to thank the Chiado Museum, specifically its director, Dr. Aida Rechena. And as you know, this first section comprises 4 papers, 4 presentations, 4 speakers, and I'm going to introduce them one at a time. I think it will work better this way. But they are, as you can check in the program, Evanthia Tsantila, who is an artist, Jesús Carrillo, Pedro de Llano, Neira, and Giulia Lamoni. So our first speaker, who is Evanthia Tsantila, graduated in 1997 from Kunstakademie Düsseldorf, where she studied with Yanis Kounelis, and in 1999 she represented Greece in the 48th Venice Biennale. Her work was shown in Cosmopolis, the first Balkan Biennale in 2004, the Prague Biennale, the Biennale of Grumini in Armenia, the first Biennale of Thessalonica in 2007, and the parallel program of the first Athens Biennale, the second and the third Biennale of Thessalonica. Evanthia Tsantila exhibited her work in solo and group shows in numerous institutions, and they are really numerous, so I'm not going to name any of them. You can just check it in Evanthia's bio. And she gave numerous lectures and workshops and took part in several forums. She is also active in the field of curatorial practice, education, and research, in projects realized in collaboration with public and private institutions and organizations. Her research attempts to question and broaden the limits of the artwork's public appearance. So welcome, Eva, and let's hear your paper. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I must say that I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to thank very much the organizing committee of the Museum Reader, the Institute de História da Arte de FCT Universidade Nova, and namely Mrs. Sandra Vieira Jurgens, and the Museu Nacional de Arte Contemporânea, Museu de Ciado, and namely Mrs. Emilia Tavares. So during the last years, Greece, a periphery country, has been brought to the center of attention and of public discourse, mainly due to the financial and political crisis that broke in 2008, caused the biggest social destruction since the end of the Second World War, and brought the country to its knees. Due to the harsh austerity measures imposed on Greece, culture was one of the first sectors to suffer major cuts. Under this state of emergency, public museums are facing dire operational difficulties, as public funding has been slashed up to 70%. This state of affairs makes it not only impossible for museums to organize and carry out programs and exhibitions, but also extremely difficult to cover normal operational costs and pay their personnel. Therefore, major private institutions such as the Onassis Foundation, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, and NEON have intensified their activities and initiated new venues, scholarships, prizes, and funding programs. In spite of the poverty and insecurity, the depression, and the general collapse of the experience around them, artists' initiatives are blossoming. New collectivities are being formed, new art spaces are inaugurating, and artistic and cultural activism is on the rise. In the middle of all this, Documenta 14, the major German organization, had moved to the strange south, announcing that they want to learn from Athens. But what precisely can be learned from the Greek experience? Let us briefly look at the burdens of Greek history that could help us better understand contemporary Greek culture. After 4 and in some areas 5 centuries under Ottoman rule, the final and successful War of Independence broke in 1821 in various parts of the land. The first Hellenic Republic was founded in 1827 and included a large part of the Central and Southern territories, as well as the Cycladic Islands. The northwest and northeast territories of Macedonia, Epirus, and Thrace, as well as Crete, joined in the beginning of the First World War. Throughout the 20th century, various successive events prevented any chance of stability in Greek society and state. Apart from First and Second World War, the Greece experienced in all its brutality, suffering massive losses. It also went through the First and Second Balkan Wars against the Turks, ended in 1922 with the so-called Great Disaster. In 1922, after the end of the Greek-Turkish War and under the terms of the Lausanne Treaty, approximately 1.5 million Christians and 500,000 Muslims were uprooted as they were forced to move, the former from Turkey to the new Greek territories and the later to Turkey in what was called the exchange of populations. During the Second World War, Nazi Germany occupied Greece for 4 disastrous years. The city of Thessaloniki suffered the loss of one of the biggest and oldest communities who had been part of the city since the end of the 15th century, when 50,000 Greek Jews perished in the Holocaust. The end of the Second World War left Greece in ruins, and the country suffered the additional tragedy of a bitter civil war fueled by foreign powers and lasting until 1949. At the end, Greece was left also divided for many decades to come. It has been in 1974, in the midst of the Civil War, that the Dodecanese Islands joined Greece, giving the modern state its present geographical borders. After a short period of 2 decades, during which people tirelessly strove for recovery, there came the April 1967 coup d'etat, and a 7-year military dictatorship was established. In the post-dictatorship years, or metapolitevsis, a period from 1974 to roughly the end of the 90s, democracy and a state based on the rule of law were established. It was at the same time that the fundaments of the welfare state were laid, naturally not without problems or weaknesses. The effort to move forward and stabilize the economy was brutally once again interrupted by the ruthless austerity program imposed on the Greek people from 2010. That program has destroyed the Greek economy, whipped out the middle class, dismantled the welfare state and its institutions, and disrupted all social cohesion. So given this history, it's not surprising that it took so long to the Greek state to inaugurate and establish public, modern, and contemporary museums. Neither it is strange that Greek citizens strongly identify with the idea of the nation, but they do not identify with their own state, and even see themselves often in opposition to it. In this context, the reason why the citizens are beset by anxious feelings of impermanence and uncertainty is more than clear. The Greeks are a people of the diaspora. At various historical moments, we have seen massive waves of immigrants to other parts of the world. It's also interesting to see how Greek society has incorporated and perverted the institutions and values of modernity. Major art movements of the last century that had little impact on artistic production in Greece. Some have argued that only in poetry modernism arrived on time in Greece. The production of images were for the greater part of the last century under shadow of the Byzantine iconographic tradition. So the majority of the Greeks are Orthodox Christians, this meaning that there is a wealth of religious images that possessing a strong symbolic power, not only enormous spiritual power, but also political power. The images that people worship are not exactly seen as visual fields of exploration, having meaning in and producing meaning out of themselves, but they are more like vessels of the spiritual beyond. This perception of the image has been dominant in society and has shaped it, not only in theological and aesthetic sense, but also in political sense. The way a society understands and perceives images is crucial in understanding how its social, national, and other identities are structured. Moreover, it provides a channel through which people express fundamental sentiments and emotions, their relation to reality, and their idea of transfiguration. So born in Thessaloniki, Greece, I left for Germany in 1991 to study in Kunstakademie Düsseldorf. Yannis Kounelis, my professor in the Kunstakademie, he was saying that he left Greece, where the Madonna was the two-dimensional figure like a decal sticker, like a Halkomania, to go to Italy, where she was a woman with flesh and blood. So during my intense years of my studies, I experienced a number of great differences between Greece and Germany that influenced my thinking and work. The mentality and habits of the people, the relation of citizens to the state and to the public space, the function of the public institutions were a few among many. In '97, while still being a student, I have initiated an exchange project, a workshop and an exhibition with 32 students from the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf and the Art School of Thessaloniki, under the supervision of Yannis Kounelis. A proposal was delivered to the Organization for the Cultural Capital of Europe, Thessaloniki '97, and after it was accepted, I undertook the organizatorial and curatorial work. As a big-scale project, it required intense, demanding, and multifaceted work over a long period of time. For that reason, I moved back to Thessaloniki for a couple of years. Our partners were Greek and German public institutions and organizations, and gave us not only the necessary means, the framework, and the time needed for completion, but also absolute freedom of action and decision, freedom of experiment and research. The realization of the project was an adventurous and complex and valuable experience. Yannis Kounelis, me, and all the students from a number of different nationalities met in May 1997, and for nearly a month, we could investigate in depth fundamental artistic issues, taking the workshop and the exhibition as a common ground for working together and learning how to understand and accept our cultural differences. Personally, I also gained useful knowledge about the nature and the attributes of the different public cultural entities, either German or Greek. At the end, one thing was certain: such a project could only have been possible with public support and funding. After the completion of the project, I returned to Germany, and since '98, I have lived in Berlin. So in '99, 2 years after finishing my studies, I have been invited to represent Greece in the 48th Venice Biennale. This meant going through all the stereotypes of this participation, the honor, the pride, and the responsibility that involves representing one's own country in such a major international exhibitions, and being strongly confronted with the perplexing and awkward idea of embodying a country. I could experience the mechanism of constructing national subjects and the processes of building a national identity. And I presented a site-specific work whose focus was the critique of institutions like the Greek Pavilion and the Biennale itself. Cultural industry and cultural tourism were also targets of my artistic strategy. So meanwhile, on the occasion of the Cultural Capital of Europe, Thessaloniki '97, the Greek government founded the State Museum of Contemporary Art in Thessaloniki. At the same time, the Center of Contemporary Art was also founded and affiliated to the museum. With funds from the European Capital of Culture, the Greek state acquired the Kostakis collection, a collection of 1,270 works of the Russian avant-garde from the early 20th century, and the collection became the museum's dowry. The National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens was also created in '97 and officially opened in 2000. So both museums were received with enthusiasm and many expectations. The National Gallery in Athens had been until then one of the few public institutions organizing big historical and modern art exhibitions. But mostly the private galleries and few private museums have been serving as the exhibition spaces for individual artists. Thessaloniki has since '79 the Macedonian Museum of Contemporary Art, a private non-profit museum which was founded upon receiving a bequest from Alexander Iola's collection, part of which is housed in the museum. The top priority of Greek cultural policies has been to support and promote cultural heritage of ancient Greece as well as the Byzantine treasures. The decision to establish not only one but two contemporary art museums came after many years of discussions and many complaints from the Greek art community, who never stopped demanding state support for contemporary art. Artists would at every opportunity express the need for the existence of public institutions, providing the conditions of showing their work and allowing them to undertake artistic research. It's interesting to compare that strong call for institutions, which was going on at the same time in countries like the USA and Germany, where institutional critique was at its highest in art discourse. It took a couple of years until the state and the National Museum could become properly operational and have a full program of exhibitions and other events. Activities in both museums started in 2000, with a series of national and international art exhibitions of Greek and non-Greek artists' work. While the museums play a variety of roles. Each one of them is based on a different set of concepts and perspectives and has developed along different lines. Both have produced art exhibitions, run contemporary art exhibitions, and shown artworks from famous collections, both modern and contemporary. They have also given the opportunity to many artists to produce and show new work. They have also run multiple educational programs, organized and hosted conferences, lectures, artists' talks, and workshops. So from their foundation to the present day, despite the spreading crisis, the two museums have had a great impact on artists' communities and have played a significant role in artistic production. Since 2007, the State Museum of Contemporary Art in Thessaloniki, supported by the Ministry of Greek Culture and funded by EU funds, is also organizing the Thessaloniki Biennale. In Athens, the National Museum of Contemporary Art had no collection to begin with, but the inaugural director, Mrs. Anna Kafetsi, who served until November 2014, has managed to put together a collection of a vast number of artworks of Greek and non-Greek artists. Together with the main program, the museum inaugurated in 2010 a separate program called Project Room, this one being supported by private funds. Artists were invited to produce and show new artworks, which became part of the museum's collection. In the autumn of 2011, the Ministry of Culture and Tourism set up a working group whose task was to draft a study for public policy in the fields of contemporary culture. This initiative arose out of the realization that the entire field has not been subject to a coherent and comprehensive approach by the state. The working group was tasked with submitting a comprehensive proposal whose starting points concerned the following 4 topics: creating structures, planning and implementing a comprehensive and coherent cultural policy, strengthening a public art organizations, the regional cultural policy, and promoting and supporting Greek cultural creativity abroad. The result of this study was the formulation of a proposal for a new cultural policy that was put to public consultation in March 2012 and served as a base for debate and exchange of ideas. But just 2 months later, the government of George Papandreou has been forced to resign and the study was shelved. In countries like Greece, art and culture have always received only a small percentage of the overall state budget, and even with the allocated funds, contemporary art was never a priority. Art, and in particular contemporary art, has still a long way to go before becoming well established as something essential and necessary for society. In such cultures, there's a long practice of private institutions and foundations, often playing the role of main benefactors and supporters of contemporary art, and sometimes even playing the role of the Ministry of Culture. It's important to see public institutions, and in particular the museum, in relation to historical and geographical specificity, to understand the needs of the artists and all those involved in cultural policies and productions, to motivate the people to visit the museums and consider it as an institution that belongs to them. The role and strategy, the policies and the content of public museums in Greece are not similar to those in Germany and those in Portugal. A comparison of the different functions of public art institutions in such countries can be easily made, and the differences can be clarified. Let me elaborate by giving a few examples. It's difficult to imagine a non-Greek director being appointed in either of the 2 public museums, or in public institutions in general, or even in private museums. Recent experience has shown that when such an appointment takes place, things don't end well. The director has to meet the objectives of the job, to know very well the complexities of the institution and the local society, and last but not least, also has to be accepted by the people. Germany, differently, has a great number of public museums run by German as well as non-German staff, the appointment changing every 3 to 5 years. But it should be noted here that all the key political positions with regard to culture are held by Germans. Both approaches seem to be legitimate, serve particular cultural and political interests, and fulfill certain needs. Transparency is another interesting issue. German public museums are reluctant to reveal information on the amounts of the donations they receive, or even the names of their donors. On the other hand, the Greek state has introduced in 2010 an online platform called Transparency, Diavia, where since then all decisions on expenses, billing, and other financial matters of all public institutions, including the museums, are uploaded and made available to the public. Another marked phenomenon is the rise of new art circles of even growing and expanding financial power and influence. Increasingly, collectors have come to open their own museums. This state of affairs has become the subject of critical debate, and not only in specializing art magazines, but also in the mainstream media. In a ranking of countries with more private museums, Germany comes third with 42, just after South Korea and the USA. Public and private institutions and artists' initiatives are all necessary, but some balance is strongly needed. Given the acceleration of advance from private initiatives, it's imperative to redress the balance with strong public museums. It's not either some ideological or entrepreneurial attachment or any voluntary choices that forces public museums in most European countries to seek outside sponsors and funding. It's the very need to survive. Within a landscape permitted by the logic of market forces, public museums have to take on a new role based on the market economy models. In the Greek experience, this international trend finds its sharpest expression as the question of survival, or more accurately of mere survival. It's a most urgent and pressing one. The public museums is now faced with an internal contradiction. On one hand, in order to survive, it had to become what its critics call cultural industry. On the other hand, it has to retain its public and social role over and above the dictates of the market forces. The self-contradiction raises many questions such as, are we prepared to lose public institutions altogether? Does the public want to turn into mere culture clients? Do we want every free production to be subject to privatized institutions? What are the ramifications and implications of this entire paradigm? In the midst of the real catastrophic crisis in Greece, the Documenta 14 declaration of its intention to learn from Athens has created much expectations in the local art scene. However, the hopes of Greek artists have not yet been answered. Few attempts have hitherto been made by the Documenta 14 team to meet the Athenian public, and it remains to be seen whether it can successfully deal with the many challenges of such an ambitious project. Apparently, it was yesterday that it was a press conference from Documenta team, and the Athens part took place in Berlin, in Germany, about the program and some of the plans. So Greece is a society in rapid transition. Through the past year, stereotypes about the mentality of the Greek people have multiplied. But what really do we know about the Greek people and Greek culture? What attracts people's interest to what is unfolding in the Greek society? What does one seek to learn from it? What narratives, what tools, what strategies can one employ in the process of approaching and listening to people who are under what can be described without hyperbole as a state of emergency? So, in the last years, very radical changes have widened the gap between the wealthy north and the poor south of Europe. And the differences between the societies in which I live, work, and move have become much more pronounced. Since 2011, I live between Berlin and Lisbon. Its rather valuable experience opened a new perspective and gave me an incentive to reconsider my relation to Greece and to Germany, and to find ways to approach deeper the culture in Portugal. The new situation has shed new light on questions of identity, language, nationality, history, trauma, memory. Paradoxically, the more my life has expanded, the more choices I seem to have, the more mobile I became, the more I found myself retreating into an inner space of contemplation. The crazy speed and the enormous pressure for exposure has increased my feeling of alienation, being always on the move, in a continuous state of non-belonging. But at times, as times are dark and unpredictable, there is an urgent demand to take action and try to stand up for the autonomy and freedom of artistic creation and production, and to argue that only such autonomy and freedom can secure art's public place in society. In the last decades, we have witnessed the emergence of the so-called creatives. But a creative person is not necessarily an artist, and creativity is a moment among others in the production of artworks. So in this context, one may ask, what is the role of the art and of the artists now? Nowadays, once more, artists in all parts of Europe are redefining the relationship with the institutions. Art has a deeply political character. The making of a work of art is a complex and fragile process. It comes to light through an opaque passage. It is seen and sensed first, rather than first understood and bought. During the last years, artists are faced with a precarious situation. They are forced to compete for funding and struggle to make a living. In the current conditions, the support for artistic research has become more rare, and more reasons for public institutions to step in and guarantee the conditions for such work. As many people in Greece have rather plausibly argued, what has risen out from the present crisis are also problems that have been festering for quite some time. That is, these are not simply the results of economic hardship and budgetary cuts. However, both citizens and the state are now called upon to see the historical moment, undoubtedly both painful and catastrophic, as a unique opportunity for learning valuable lessons from it. It's time for reflection, for critique and self-critique. A time to take stock, reconsider and reinvent a new role for public institutions and to plan a new cultural policy beyond the ideological stereotypes. At present, the state has to set a basic framework of rules and assume all political responsibility, having the indispensable and not delegated role of planning and implementing pluralistic and democratic cultural policies. The public museum enjoys an all too necessary independence, thus ensuring the possibility and continuation of critical thinking, free artistic production, experimentation, and research. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Evanthia, for bringing us such important questions. And we'll now listen to Jesús Carrillo, who comes from Universidade Autónoma de Madrid. Jesús Carrillo has a degree in art history from the University of Murcia, a master's in historical studies from the Warburg Institute of the University of London, and a PhD in history from the University of Cambridge. He has been a guest researcher at the Huntington Library in LA, Brown University in Rhode Island, and the Higher Council for Scientific Research in Madrid. Since 1997, he has been a professor in the Department of History and Theory of Art at the Autonomous University of Madrid. And since July 2008 until December 2014, he has directed the Cultural Program Department of the Reina Sofia Museum. Carrillo has written and edited several publications, including, well, you will check the titles in his in his bio, of course. So thank you for being here, Jesús. We're going to listen to your paper, and it is titled, well, you can check it already, Conspiratorial Institutions, Museums and Social Transformation in the Post-Crisis Period. So thank you. You're welcome.
I can do it here. Muito obrigado. Yeah, the two of them?
Yes.
Well, the state of my voice doesn't reflect how comfortable I feel and how happy I'm here in Lisbon. Thank you, Sandra, and thanks to the organization for letting me in. I'll try to keep to my notes so that I keep the time. I just note that sometimes I use the we to talk about the institution and the museum, even if I'm not anymore within one of them. I'm now part of the university. But I still believe, as Fran said, in some of the missions of the institution. And it's from my experience working within the Reina Sofia Museum for 6 years, and also in the city's council only for 8 months, that I'm speaking from. Also, my apologies for being a little rhetorical in my speech. rhetorical, more not so forensic as epidectic, but I promise the organizers if I'm given the opportunity to write something a little more analytical. But I thought that the occasion was good to write something a little more rhetorical, more provocative. That's why I chose the notion of conspiracy and conspiratorial. And my apologies again for last time for being so Hispanocentric. I think it's a bias we have, and it's just something that comes unconsciously. So my apologies coming first, because what I'm talking about is related to my experience in Spain and mainly in Madrid. The rise and particularly the fall of alter-worldism in the first decade of the new millennium brought about an unexpected institutionalist political imagination European social movements, perhaps as a deferred action of the virtualities of the general intellect revealed around 1968. But to embrace the issue of the institution was contranatural and a risky business for antagonist movements. But the system crisis that revealed itself in the first years of the new century made evident the blatant deficiency, obsolescence, and even banal nature of existing structures. The emperor was naked, and he was obscenely displaying the violent and arbitrary source of his power. The Universidad Nómada appeared in Spain in early 2000 as one of the conveyors of this instituent imagination. Formed by individuals with a loose profile and ease with the conventional boundaries of academia, activism, and art, Universidad Nómada was born as a war machine designed to develop new conceptual tools to understand, and I quote, the specific patterns of exploitation and domination we are submitted today, and to devise projects and actions able to short-circuit them, end quote. Meanwhile, public institutions, or museums among them, overgrown in Spain after a decade of massive real estate speculation, were trapped in the governance of an opaque mass of individualized subjects, being their sustainability underscored by the neoliberal regime they were obliged to serve. The unbearable awareness of living on the edge and in a state of structural crisis made some cultural institutions look around and recognize in the questions of institutionality raised by social movements a possible raison d'être, an ultimate lifesaver against the danger of zombification, which threatened most museums. They found in this radical imagination an echo of the promises of emancipation of avant-garde movements and a link with 70s and 80s institutional critique. More importantly, it provided a horizon towards which to look up in a time when they were obliged to keep their eyes on their feet as the floor was cracking beneath. Jorge Ribalta, director by then of public activities at MACBA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, was pioneering in recognizing that to engage with the activities of the so-called new social movements was the only way to go beyond the tendency to replace the old bourgeoisie notion of the public with that of the consumer, and to, I quote Jorge, to understand publics as transformers and not as reproducers, and end quote. Transformation was only possible by strategically suspending the monopoly on cultural value, held by museums and art institutions, and explicitly recognizing the autonomy and authority of agents beyond their close, hierarchical, bureaucratic structures. But this recognition was an endeavor which very few institutions were in conditions to carry out. Alliances were held and projects were developed in which monstrous institutions, as experimental movement structures called themselves, and progressive institutions, as our museums were eventually called, improvised and negotiating a common ground for action. And on many occasions, they failed. On our side, the side of the institution, and what you see, that our still is very much in the museum. This was made possible probably due to the increasingly thin walls of institutions and the proverbial ambivalence of artists, academics, and curators, who were frequently acting as double agents, or at least bearing a double mask. On the side of the movements, this was seen as a way out from previous cul-de-sac and as a necessary step in the longer-term task of building institutions anew. In 2007, Raúl Sánchez Cedillo, a founding member of Universidad Nómada, used a little-known text by Deleuze on David Hume's work, Instincts and Institutions, to rescue a notion of institution that, unlike laws, were structures of social invention, means to vehicle individual experience to satisfaction, to affirmative and non-constraining nor exclusionary modes of action. Raúl's text towards new political creation, movements, institutions, new militancy, was part of an issue of Transversal, that you may know, an internet journal that the EIPCP, that's the name of the European Institute for Progressive Cultural Policies, devoted to these instituent practices in 2007. It's available online. The case of Reina Sofía intervention on behalf of La Casa Invisible in Málaga is an example of one of these experiments. As you may know, La Casa Invisible is a CSA, as we call them in Spain, an autonomous social center occupying an abandoned building in downtown Málaga. It's a squatter house, which in 2007 brought together activists, artists, architects, and neighbors as a counterpoint to the tourist-based cultural policies of Málaga City Council. In June 2009, the Public Activities Department of Reina Sofía, together with Universidad Nómada, organized in the La Casa Invisible the seminar Cultural Governance versus Institutions of the Commons, the Right to the City, and New Cultural Policies, sorry. The issue at stake was the discussion of the diverse forms institutions of the commons may have from existing experiences all over Europe, from Hamburg to Seville, London, Barcelona, Venice, and Madrid. Beyond this discussion, this very timely debate in 2009, our hidden agenda was to play with the expectations of Malaga's City Council to have a branch of the prestigious Reina Sofía in Málaga, as they had with the Thyssen Museum and would have soon with the Pompidou, and so to prevent the announced eviction of the occupants. So we were organizing this with the Casa Invisible in order to create this kind of fog and to excite the ambition of the Malaga City Council that was threatening with eviction. Whether we were successful in this or not, the truth is that La Casa Invisible is still open and very active in Malaga, and they just released a new webpage. Well, this was not easy. I remember many trips to Malaga to support the survival of the institution, having the most hilarious conversations with the City Council to create or to keep that imaginary, this mirage that we were planning to have a branch of Reina Sofía in Malaga. So this is for the right of the city. And we participated in many different forums and debates. You can see there my dear colleague, Berta Sureda, that is participating in one of these discussions in this occupied squatter house, in which cultural issues were discussed together with renta básica, vivienda digna, derechos sociales, cultura libre. I even can see myself in one corner, so young. Okay. This is the web page just released of La Casa Invisible that has been on construction for quite a while, but still very, very active. I invite you to visit. The institutionalization process opened with the collaboration between the Nómada, La Casa Invisible, and Reina Sofia had or wrote about a new monstrous institution known as Fundación de los Comunes in December 2011. Actually, the creation of this foundation was one of the conditions that the City Council had in order not to evict the Casa Invisible members. Both sides, social movements and institutional people, were aware of the difficulties and contradictions of the process and were highly conscious of the fragility of our operations. But a sense of urgency made us rehearse imaginative strategies, creating the space for every new step. For once, institutions were not dictating the agenda, but participating in a process of negotiation led by others. Jaime Bindel, a researcher, in his text, The Displacement of Criticism, Cultural Institutions and Social Movements Since the 90s, a text that he published in Desacuerdos 8, that we edited together in 2014, talked about, and I quote, the uncomfortable situation of institutions, being simultaneously leading progressive institutions in Europe and moving awkwardly behind grassroots processes of political empowerment, which eventually would end up in the taking over of public institutions by destituent powers. So, I mean, just to mark the basic contradiction and the tension, more than a contradiction, that was in these negotiations or in these operations. And I end here the retrospective, and now I will just to make a short reflection on the contemporary situation. Even if today, general pessimism may obscure our diagnosis of the present, the violence of the current situation in 2017 seems to problematize severely the viability, although not the urgent need, of both instituent processes and institutional transformations, at least as we imagined them 10 years ago, in 2007. The intensification of budget cuts, bureaucratic control, and cultural wars tends to make of contemporary art institutions either complicit instruments of power or suspicious conspirators against what is described by conservatives as a vulnerable social order under attack. Within a black or white, normal or radical binary logic. In this context, our cherished artistic ambivalence has definitively lost its grounds. As long as this current state of war is going on, may we assume conspiracy as a plausible logic of action? In such a case, should we encourage an art of conspiracy? And with whom could we conspire? With which purpose? How would this conspiratorial attitude affect our definition and even our future as institutions? Conspiracy, as we know, probably all who is present here, conspiracy has always been a common practice, even structural, in our cultural public institutions, at least in Southern Europe, as the only way to dribble bureaucratic suspicion and control in order to do what we were supposed to do. As a civil servant, I've conspired with my students and colleagues at the university in order to rehearse new learning practices. I've conspired with members of the different departments of Reina Sofia to work together despite the institutional boxes we were encapsulated. I've conspired with our peers at the Internationale institutional network to adjust the rigid structure of European application to really existing projects. Conspired with a team of civil servants I worked with at the Madrid City Council to get out from our bureaucratic glass box in order to negotiate with neighbors and artistic agents. But I always found this kind of conspiracy tiring and unproductive, since it keeps the formal carcass of the institution intact while replacing its engine with an informal and intersubjective network which rarely leaves a trace behind, which rarely changes much. You could get your institutional goals only as long as you knew the right people and as a personal favor. This sort of conspiracy is not subversive. Quite the opposite. It guarantees the continuity of an inefficient institutional system and the subaltern status of workers. The kind of conspiracy we learn to develop in our institutional experimentations, first in the early steps of the Acuerdos projects that I don't have time here to describe, and then in Reina Sofia Public Activities Department, was of a different kind, or at least I wanted to see it this way. Somehow, the etymological meaning of conspiracy, conspiratio, breathing together, or even the more general sense of plotting together, was suddenly recovered. We were not conspiring within our inadequate institution in order to make it work. We were conspiring with others from our inadequate institution in order to open up the conceptual, imaginary, and political space for a different kind of institution to emerge. Our conspiracy was meant to break out the insularity and to recognize relevant others to conspire with. By the same token, we were recognized from the outside as a useful tool in an ongoing collective instituent process. Conspiracy meant blowing, breathing, plotting, knitting together at the same time as it recovered its deep subversive function, since it was ultimately oriented to the radical transformation of our institutional structures. Obviously, this kind of radicality could only be allowed if undetected, or as long as it happened under the cover of avant-garde art experimentation. But in 2011, the vision of a few became the indignación of many, and the desire of political autonomy accumulated through years mutated into a powerful image of destitution and restitution of what it was called real democracy. The rise and public visibility of a massive social movement in the 15th of May Occupy process in Madrid and the rest of the state, coinciding with the victory of conservatism in Spain, displaced institutional experimentation from the museum to the streets and squares, local assemblies, internet social networks, and eventually to new political structures. The desertion of conspirators from the museum in 2011 coincided with an increasing pressure over cultural institutions, both from the financial side, through budget cuts, the managerial, through a restriction of their autonomy, and the ideological, through the inspection and preventive clearing of any potentially subversive content they may convey. So that's the distance between the instituent process and the museum started becoming bigger. The temptation to embrace corporative powers and assuming a role within leisure and tourist industry seemed to have no alternative for the museum. But, and I end with this, I have the conviction, however, that the alternative is here and now and in the future. And it's here and now within us. We are conspiratorial institutions, endowed with a highly sophisticated tool to engage in actual processes of social transformation. We may just have to assume that conspiratorial, collective breathing attitude in the way we organize ourselves, and I think that's important, is not only about programming, it's the way we organize ourselves, the way we administrate our budgets, the way we address our constituencies, and the way we design our programs. But that would come at the end. Conspiracy, with all its subversive power, is at work when we take part in the collective and cooperative endeavor of resisting expropriation, resisting segregation, resisting commodification and banalization. But we do not need anymore that relevant other, the visionary social movements, to conspire with, as we probably did, or we thought we needed in 2007. We don't need to be anymore the exclusive and detached laboratory we once aimed at. Today, the conventional boundaries of institutions, defining clear in and out positions, are nothing but a carcass which does not say anything significant about what we are as organizations of social relations. Conspiracy involves a detachment from our traditional structures of legitimation and may bring unexpected travel companions, people you would have never recognized as your peers, since conspiracy means negotiating with others in difficult times. Conspiracy means a commitment with a collective cause, but it also implies secrecy. To operate within a dead angle from which you will not be seen by power. Otherwise, would be a spectacularization of conspiracy. And also involves the risk of being discovered, exposed, and erased. Conspiracy, the act of blowing together, may be the only way we have today to build institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesús, for your presentation and for this inspiring perspective. So our third speaker is Pedro de Llano Neira, who is an art historian and curator based in Santiago de Compostela, Spain. His exhibitions include In Search of the Miraculous 30 Years Later, focus on Base and Other, Centro Galego de Arte Contemporânea in Santiago de Compostela, 2010, The Black Whale, who took place at the Museum of Arte Contemporânea de Vigo in 2012, and the first retrospective of Maria Teresa Alves at the Centro Andaluz de Arte Contemporânea in Sevilla in 2015. The latter was followed by a monograph co-published with Sternberg Press in 2017, yes. And he has written for art magazines including Exit Express, After All, Springerin, and Text to Kunst, as well as La Vanguardia newspaper. He is currently preparing a book on Base and Other, supported by a postdoctoral position at the University of Santiago de Compostela. So Pedro de Llano Neira's papers is titled New Institutionalism, Then and Now. We're going to listen to you, and thank you for being here.
Obrigado. Bem, bom dia todavía. E obrigado pela apresentação e pelo convite para falar cá em Lisboa, uma cidade que é muito especial para mim, Portugal em geral, vindo desde Galicia, falando esta espécie de português do século XII, como dice bom amigo meu do Porto, sempre que me apresenta a pessoas europeias, americanas, ele diz, o Pedro de Llano que fala português do século XII. Não vou falar português do século XII hoje, não vos preocupar. I'm going to shift to English. I'll try to do it as best as possible. And again, thanks the organization, thanks to Sandra and Emilia for putting together this great conference that I agree is never enough to discuss the role of the museum in the contemporary world, especially after all the changes and shiftings that the institutions have gone through in the last 10 to 20 years, right? So I think I will place my intervention that will be like a kind of case study in this same framework as Jesús and also Maria were talking about before me, similar historical framework, also trying to speak from a specific context, which is in my case Galicia, also Spain, so with the hope that we can also enter into an exchange out of this specificity. First of all, I would like to apologize for two things, for talking about a project that I have done as a curator 10 years ago, also because it's a project that is a bit old already, but again, I think we can update from this experience something. The project that I'm going to address was titled The Museum as a Medium. I can change here. I don't want to mess up. Here, right? Yeah. Okay, obrigado. The Museum as a Medium took place in the museum in the Marco de Vigo in 2008. It was my very first experience as a curator, and I was very lucky to have a chance to do a project like this that was a collective show with 20 artists, just as a first experience, right, with a great team in Marco and a big and beautiful building. I did this together with another curator. We did it together, whose name is Pablo Fanego. Who is a person that I have been working and exchanging a lot of ideas and discussions since the early 2000s, when he invited me to join a project in Fundación Luis Oane in A Coruña. That was a kind of get-together of different artists and curators and writers in Galicia, that out of which a lot of projects came. So with Pablo, I have been discussing and thinking about different things since, as I said, early 2000s. And after 2004, approximately, we started to talk and discuss more concretely this Museum as Medium project, which was a project that reacted to our interest and curiosity for some artists and curators of our generation, and a generation maybe slightly older than us by that time. I'm talking about artists. This is the artist list of the show that we put together, the Museum as Medium. People like Roman Onda, Kanika Eriksson, Andrea Fraser, Tino Segal, Sergio Prego in Spain, or Maria Eichhorn. Artists which were not only proposing new ways of addressing their institutions, but also building this approach on a very specific tradition that I think it's gonna come out in different moments in this Congress on conceptual art and institutional critique. And our project have had different contexts that I will go through very briefly. Context of Europe and Spain, the international and Spanish artistic context, again in the 90s and early 2000s, and this more specific context of those debates about institutional critique, site-specific art, and also so-called new institutionalism that was kind of being formed by that time. To make a long story short, the story of my country in the 20th century, I would like just to mention four important dates that were the Civil War in the 30s, the end of Franco's dictatorship in the 70s, in 75, and the beginning of a new the Constitution in 78, the moment of 92, which was a moment of euphoria in my country, and the moment of 2008. All these moments have a common thread, which is a kind of struggle with the idea of modernity, the denial of this idea when Franco won the war, the Civil War in 1939, and the kind of expulsion or rejection of all these ideas of modernity during the dictatorship, especially in the cultural field. And then the will and the wish to go back or to re-engage in a discussion with modernity after 75, when democracy entered our country again, and a kind of, again, like a boom of a very specific understanding of this concept, especially in the early 90s, in 1992, with these two big celebrations that we have in Spain, that were the Olympic Games in Barcelona, that were kind of sold outside of our country as the image of success, of the return to the path of modernity of Spain, that were modelic, that were building new cities. So that was important in this story, in the story of my country in the 20th century. So it's both, at the same time, an idea of modernity that has to do with a material basis and progress, but also about education, emancipation, and cultural field. There were two very important points that I also would like to highlight in the 80s to understand how the institutional process of my country happened in the 90s. That were the consolidation of a free market system in a social democratic context when the Socialist Party came into the government in 1982. And second was the entrance of Spain in 1986 together with Portugal in the European Union. So again, since that time, Spain kind of came back to this discussion of modernity, and then the last part of this historical moment was, I think, the period between 92 and 2008, which was a moment of very intense economic growth, based mainly in two business that were real estate and tourism, and the arriving of 7 million, close to 7 million immigrants to Spain in between 2000 and 2008. The country grew from 40 to 47 millions. And all this kind of exploded in 2008. Parallel to this, we have the story of the artistic context that I will summarize very, very quickly. I don't want to rely too much on this introduction or context. That had two main actors or two main protagonists. First was the establishing of an art fair in 1982 in Spain, Arco, that we all know because it's kind of a shared fair for Portugal and Spain. That in Spain had a very important role. It marked a lot of the policies and the attitudes that the art world was going to follow in the next years. So this is very particular for my country, that a lot of behaviors in the art world were marked by a fair and by market, right? And that had a lot of influence on I think, on also the way museums perceive themselves. And there was also a kind of relation of dependency of museums with the market and Arco having such a strong impact on my country. And also, again, a relation of centrality, from Arco in Madrid in relation to the rest of the country, and how everything kind of find a place there. So in the 90s, there was this craziness in Spain, thanks to, in good part, of funds coming from the European Union to build museums. This is the CEGAC that opened in 1993 in my hometown in Santiago de Compostela. This is again in the 90s with a piece by Vito Acconci that was installed in the facade of the museum. A piece by Lothar Baumgarten in Magba already in the 2000s. So all these fancy buildings by main architects from Álvaro Siza to Richard Meyer and so many others, right? That were being built in Spain with this idea that we wanted to conquer modernity. And modernity was something that was not only having freeways, trains, TGVs and all that, but also having museums and this carcass, to employ the word that Jesus was employing to describe or define the museum, a carcass that was very expensive and in some cases even huge, even big. So for many politicians in Spain, this was the very final step of conquering modernity or returning to the path of modernity again, to have a very spectacular museum of contemporary art. This, in a way, was sometimes misguided or having different kind of nuances 97, Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao opened, changing a lot this process, because it was an American model, a private model in Bilbao with a different orientation into tourism and spectacle. This really changed a lot of things in the way that the institutions were being built and considered. For example, bringing to Santiago this project of Ciudad de la Cultura de Galicia, which is a project that began in 1999 and has been under construction for nearly 20 years, but it stopped 2 or 3 years ago because of lack of funds. There was no money to keep building it, and the objective and the function of it was very blurry or no concrete. So, facing this reality, for Pablo, my colleague, and me in 2008, when we began to operate as curators in the artistic field, we were really challenged by all this situation of this generation of new institutions that were established in my country between the 90s and the 2000s, and we were facing a very simple question: what after we have been creating all these new institutions, what is left to do with them? What we want to do? What do we want from our institutions, our public resources? How do we want them to function beyond the more technical or practical point of view? So, what is the potential of the museum in the 21st century? It was basically a collective process that we were taking part of, together with the artists, with other curators, with social movements as well, with civil society, with everybody, of really defining what was the role of the museum in a country like Spain by that time. So it was, to put it kind of more visually, like going from concrete, from a period of concrete to a period of ideas and people, from hardware into software. There was a discursive context that, of course, we relied on. This is again the Ciudad de la Cultura in Santiago. That was important for me, and that I will also pass fast. But I want to mention, because I think probably we can address it on maybe discussions later or later during the day, kind of discursive and theoretical background that was composed by books and articles, like a famous article by James Mayer, The Functional Site, or The Transformation of Site Specificity. That was like a very ground basis for us to depart from our project. Other books, like The Birth of the Museum by Tony Bennett, that is a more historical account of the institution, and that was particularly recommended by one of the artists that took place in this project, The Museum as Medium, that is the British-German artist Tino Segal. And of course, all these readers on institutional critique and new institutionalism that were being published exactly by that moment. John Welkman, Institutional Critique, Nina Monman, Art and Its Institutions, and so on. This term, new institutionalism, that we were sharing also, was introduced by Jonas Ekeberg in the first issue of a publication series called Verksted, that was published by the Office for Contemporary Art in Norway in 2003. In this text, Ekeberg was regarded discussion on new institutionalism, as a valuable opportunity to focus on the relation between artistic production, public institution, and social change. New institutionalism saw museums and art institutions as places of production, sites of research, and spaces for debate, active space between community center, laboratory, and academy, in opposition to maybe the more traditional idea of the museum as just a space of showing art or displaying art. So trying to make it more complex. And finally, new institutionalism, something that we, of course, agreed with, engage with institutions as negotiable entities. This concept was important for Pablo and me when we were curating this project, the museum as medium. We agreed with all these ideas, but nonetheless there were also differences beyond the cultural distance among most of these discourses coming from north of Europe, from countries where the welfare state was very well established since decades ago, like Germany, Scandinavia, and so on, and our situation in Galicia and the periphery of Spain. Possibly our project tried to keep the focus on the institution itself instead of spreading out too much into other urban or social realities as other artists in new institutionalism were doing. But I think at that precise moment, the idea of keeping the debate more specifically on the institution itself as a medium, that was the word that we chose, or the concept we chose to deal with the museum, was kind of operative by that moment. The consideration of the exhibition space and the institution as simultaneously a material and very specific, also geographically, entity, and an immaterial discursive reality, as a kind of dispositive or medium, as the title read finally. So the exhibition that we put together, I will have two venues in Vigo and in San Sebastian in the Basque Country. I will only mention the one in Vigo for time matters. Happened in this building that was important for us for many different reasons. This material reality of the building of the Marco Museum in Vigo by that time. Marco was inaugurated at the end of 2002 in Vigo, a city that is very much defined by its industrial character and fishing port, and which expanded the city in a very uncontrolled way in the 60s and 70s. So the absence of any city planning at the time, when Franco's policy of urban development was at its most rampant, situation caused the destruction of numerous public spaces and the separation of the city from the sea in the case of Vigo, and the disappearance of a large part of its historical patrimony. So Marco, that is this building that used to be a jail built in the 19th century, came into this situation with a kind of double function. On one side, it was supposed to be a meeting place, given the non-existence of other public spaces or relevant public spaces in the city, and on the other had the idea of keeping part of the memory of the city of Vigo that was really sweeping out a lot of historical sites in the form of a museum. So this is a few images of the Marco as it was still in the 70s, 80s. It then later on was a court, for trials, and it also was a jail during the Franco time. So now coming to the point that I wanted to show to finish my presentation. I want to just mention that there were two kinds of works that we selected in this show. Works that were made in different contexts and times from the early 90s that we kind of selected and brought to Vigo, and other works that were site-specific, that were made specifically for the situation in Vigo. On the first group, we could have artists like Andrea Fraser, Monica Momicini, Luca Frey, and on the other, artists like Roman Ondak, Maria Eichhorn, or Sergio Prego. These are some examples of pieces by Roman Ondak, that he built this plinth when you were to get your ticket. A very important one that was made in New York in the early 90s, that's called May I Help You by Andrea Fraser, that I think it made a kind of historical background for the situation we wanted to address in Vigo in 2008. This is Sergio Prego, a Spanish artist that built a performative structure that also helped to show a video. Lara Almarcegui. But I want to focus on one specific work, which is this work by Maria Eichhorn, that was made specifically for Vigo. Maria Eichhorn is a German artist that started to work in the early 90s or late 80s in Berlin, and that has been very much related to the updating, if you want to call it like that, of the legacy of institutional critique and conceptual art in the generation of the 90s and 2000s. So it was for us really a referential artist to work with, to help us think what is the relation and what is the function of the museum, in the relation of the artist with the museum and the function of the museum in the present time in 2008. So we invited Maria Eichhorn to participate in this show, and she, like happens in this situation, she came to Vigo to work with us, and we initiated a process of research and trying to find different ideas that she could work with in the exhibition. This all took shape when we found this letter. So actually someone gave us this letter. That was a letter written by a person in the jail in Marco in 1937. That was put there by the fascist authorities. He was a Republican, and well, they put him into jail like many other people. And this is the letter that he wrote the day before he was executed, killed by the fascists in the war. And it was addressed to his girlfriend, Angelina Estevez. The name of the person that was killed is José Domínguez. And it has a very intimate and also historical meaning. So out of this document, just a letter, Maria Eichhorn asked us to build a piece with 3 parts. That was just to show the piece in the space, following this very specific protocol with a kind of a pedestal, and so the letter has 2 sides, it could be read. Then she wanted us to publish the letter in the local newspaper as a call for a conference or lecture that we're going to, a roundtable that we were going to organize with people that knew about the context of the letter. So this is the letter published as a kind of ghost in the local newspaper. And finally celebrating this roundtable, discussing the contents of this letter of this person that was there in 1937. So obviously this work proposed an entire series of questions that have to do with the renewed attitude and commitment that many artists have taken on recently in respect to institutions. Something that I didn't mention yet, and I think it's important to end up with this presentation, is that the museum in which we were working and that we were addressing, the museum as a medium, Marco, has no collection. It's called as a museum, but it has no collection. By the same token, the other museum in Galicia, the CEGAC, is called as a Centro de Arte Contemporánea and has a collection. It's an actual museum. So this is interesting regarding Maria Eichhorn's work because it made impossible that such a project that had a very specific conditions, because the object didn't belong to the artist, belonged to a local person in Vigo, and that she was willing to donate to the museum, couldn't stay at Marco. It couldn't be collected, and it couldn't be part of its memory and process that would be part of its memory and the process that will be initiated with it. So a work that in fact, from my point of view, was important for the institution and the city, and that we could argue that it was intended to be as a kind of monument, virtually disappear after the show, leaving no traces and building no memory except for the book. And I think this is a very important, the book, I mean the catalog of exhibition. I think this is a very important point, the inability to plant seeds or the sterility to create a process that can follow in time, that had consequences in the future, and that I think we can discuss later. Because the museum, the Marco, is now going through a very complicated situation. It's almost on the verge of disappearing. It has suffered the withdrawal of a lot of supports. So this situation that we had in 2008 with the hopes and promises of new institutions, building new institutions, has been practically swept out by the situation that came exactly in 2008 when we were doing our exhibition in Vigo with the crisis. So just to end, Yes, museums in the 21st century, I agree, should be tools for research, for production and debate, as new or experimental institutionalism called for. They should be imaginative, they should be open, they can be schools, they can be laboratories, they can be many other things, but above all, they also might keep being what they have always been. Places to collect artworks and build memories, collective memories, forgotten memories and repressed memories that help us to deal with that mirage that we call spectacle. So, thanks very much and apologies for going too late.
Thank you, Pedro, for your contribution. So, last but not least, we're going to listen to Giulia Lamoni's paper, which is titled Looking Beyond the Global Dream, Transnational Challenges in the Modern and Contemporary Art Museum. So, Giulia Lamoni is an art historian exploring the articulations between art and feminisms in Portugal and Brazil in the 60s and 70s, the relations between contemporary art and migratory processes, and the shaping of transnational artistic networks, heterogeneous forms of collaboration and dialogue from the 60s to the present. She's a visiting assistant professor at Nova University in Lisbon and a researcher at the Art History Institute at the same university. She holds a PhD in Aesthetics, Arts and Sciences of Art from the University of Paris I, Panthéon-Sorbonne. And she co-curated the exhibitions Cohabitar at Casa da América Latina in Lisbon last year, and a solo exhibition on the work of artist Eugenia Musa at Quadrum Gallery, which I think is still ongoing. Giulia texts have been published in Third Text and Pen Paradoxa, International Feminist Art Journal, and in exhibition catalogues and books from Centro de Arte Modern, Gulbenkian Foundation, Centre Pompidou, and Tate Modern. As a member of the Brooks Fellowship Program 2017, while at Delfina Foundation in London, she works with Tate Modern Curatorial on her research projects on new curatorial and museological methodologies for exploring non-Western approaches to examining art history. Thank you, Giulia, and we'll listen to you.
Sitting here. Thank you very much to the organizers of the exhibition for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here and part of this panel. I actually changed the title while I was preparing the text. So it's not the one that you see on the program, but is rather Looking Beyond the Global Dream, Transnational Challenges in the Modern and Contemporary Art Museum. So last week at the symposium titled Collecting Art by Women at Whitechapel Gallery in London, curator Camille Morino, the founder of the platform AWARE, Archives of Women Artists, Research and Exhibitions, and the newly appointed director of La Monnaie Art Center in Paris, publicly praised the new display of collection at Tate Modern for its capacity to include a large number of female artists as well as artists from a variety of geographical and cultural locations outside Europe and North America. According to the museum's press release, 75% of the artworks presented in the new display of the collection, inaugurated in June 2016, were acquired since 2000, thus reflecting the way in which the collection has been transformed since Tate Modern's opening to the public in 2000. In an interview with Art newspaper in May of last year, Francis Morris, who is the current director of the institution, described the new hung of the collection and the opening of the new building, the Switch House, in the following terms, I quote, "The significant shift is to a much more international picture. The work is very diverse as there is a real shift from the dominant center to multiple interconnected centers. Although 75% of the work now on show is new, it's not all contemporary. The collection was originally built according to a dominant art history, which we are very familiar with, but the real history is a much bigger one, because the dominant history left out a lot of places and a lot of practices and a lot of women artists," end quote. Although Tate Modern's inaugural temporary exhibition, Century City, in 2001, paved the way for the museum to engage in a more international understanding of artistic production in the 20th century by considering the role of 9 different cities as significant centers of cultural transformation. That was, of course, New York, Paris, London, Vienna, Moscow, but also Mumbai, Lagos, Tokyo, and Rio de Janeiro. Its initial display of the collection in 2000, organized around specific thematic line, attracted criticism because of its lack of diversity in geographical and cultural terms. For example, in The Post-Colonial Constellation, an essay written by Okwi and Vezer and first published in 2003, he explored, among many other elements, the curatorial choices associated to the theme, the nude action body, in the collection display at Tate Modern. Without entering the details of Enver's analysis, the absence of artists from Africa whose work was, in his view, particularly relevant in the constellation articulated by the curators, as well as the treatment of Western African sculpture as evidence rather than as work of art, prompted him to consider that, I quote, "The very idea that there might be an African conception of modernity does not even come up, nor does the possibility that between Western modernist artists in correspondence with their African contemporaries there existed and now exists an affiliative spirit of mutual inference and recognition, end quote. In fact, according to Envezer, in the new display, I quote, "What was concretely conveyed was an untroubled attitude, a singular point of view, a sense of sovereign judgment," end quote. It is particularly challenging to reconsider this debate today in light of Tate Modern's declared effort to articulate new narratives that develop from and through artworks from a variety of regions previously excluded from Western canonical views of modernity. Adopting Tate Modern's newly inaugurated display as a case study, this paper proposes to move beyond the simple question of inclusion to explore some of the heterogeneous challenges that emerge from the process of acquiring, collecting, and exhibiting artworks from a variety of cultural contexts, challenges that are, of course, curatorial, art historical, educational, but also economic and ethical. My aim is to articulate a set of questions, share my doubts with you, and propose a glimpse into a research that is currently ongoing and that will certainly benefit from the debates that will develop here today. My position in this frame is rather peculiar. I'm not a museum studies scholar, as many of my colleagues here, nor a museum professional, but rather an art historian whose interests focus, among other things, around transnational nodes in art historical and curatorial discourses. At the same time, my relation with Tate Modern is neither that of an insider nor that of a complete outsider. Currently, in a curatorial residence at Delfina Foundation in London, I am collaborating for a short period of time with Tate Modern as a Brooke International Fellow in an internal study concerning curatorial methodologies to address transnationality and multiple modernities within Tate collection. One of the questions that I asked myself when looking at Tate Modern's new display of the collection concerned the challenging of art historical canons. Does the opening of the museum's collection to works by artists from many different geographical and cultural areas, such as, for example, Ibrahim El-Salahi from Sudan, Jego from Venezuela, Salwa Shuker from Lebanon, and Sheila Goda from India, just to name a few, constitute a simple expansion of Western art historical canons that does not interfere with the canon's various structures and their production of divisions between an inside and an outside? Or does this inclusion set in motion a process oriented towards a different understanding of artistic practice and art history altogether and its relation with society and culture at large? Is the museum really open to transformation provoked by cross-cultural encounters and the inevitable ruptures, conflicts, and dissonances that may emerge from it? In the late 90s, Griselda Pollock proposed an analysis of canons through the lenses of Raymond Williams' reading of Gramsci's notions of hegemony. I quote, "All hegemonic systems," wrote Pollock, "depend on their survival on some degree of pliability towards the forces or groups which contest or resist incorporation. This opposition must either be included or disqualified," end quote. And she adds, I quote, "Certain activities or positions may be incorporated better to protect the underlying interest by concession and innovation," end quote. Considering the danger of hegemonic absorption of dissonant practices into canonical art historical and curatorial discourses, which would imply the neutralization of disruptive questions that may defy Western construction of notions of quality, influence, originality, work of art versus artifact, etc., how did the museum respond to the different challenges posed by newly acquired works from a variety of world regions? It is, of course, difficult to answer this question in a univocal form. As T.J. Demos indicated a few years ago in a much quoted passage, Tate is, I quote, "not some monolithic entity operating under a single law, not a monster museum of privatization masquerading as a democratic public institution. In fact, the Tate Galleries represent a complex institution comprising museums in Liverpool, St. Ives, and London, each subdivided into various departments operated by a variety of agents." And he also writes, "If Tate Modern is exemplary of the museum in the age of globalization, and indeed it is the most visited museum of the modern art world, welcoming nearly 5 million visitors per year, then it is because today's global museum is a space of conflict, diverse function, and mixed political effects," end quote. In this contradictory and multi-layered frame, the main divisions of the new display, such as artists and society, material and objects in the studio, and media networks in the boiler house, do not immediately suggest a specific dislocation of previous approaches, nor a rupture with conventional terminology. At the same time, some micro-narratives within it seem to assume, on a smaller scale, the necessity of taking some risks and experimented with different curatorial formats. I am referring in particular to 4 rooms titled A View from São Paulo, from Buenos Aires, from Tokyo, and from Zagreb. First of all, these rooms respond to the need of finding a solution for a complex problem that inhabits the whole collection. The acquisition of artworks from different regions in the world is highly, although not exclusively, reliant on a number of acquisition committees in which private donors sit and to which they contribute financially. The first acquisition committee, the North American one, was created in 2001 and then followed the Latin American one in 2002, the Asia Pacific 2007, Middle East and Northern African in 2009, and then more recently, South Asian, Russian, and Eastern Europe in 2012. Thus, this division, which is matched by curatorial staff with a specific expertise in each of these regions, is structural and structuring the collection itself. The rooms A View From propose a display mode focusing on a number of moments of encounter and co-participation involving artists of different nationalities, thus bridging over the regional divisions within the collection. These moments are constituted by exhibition considerably particularly significant as transnational and transformative nodes in the history of contemporary art, modern and contemporary art. In this sense, they temporarily suspend the thematic breadth of the display and reintroduce art history, and more specifically the history of exhibitions, as an important tool to shape a more transnational approach to artistic practice. The room A View from Zagreb, you see here very bad photographs that I took with my iPhone, I'm sorry, the quality is not there, curated by Valentina Ravaglia, possibly the most cohesive one, presents open and kinetic works by artists who exhibited in the New Tendencies exhibitions in Zagreb between 61 and 73. It includes artists like Carlos Cruz Diaz, Jesus Rafael Soto, Dada Maino from Italy, Vasarely and Francisco Sobrino, along with archival material from the exhibition presented in a display case. Sorry, this one is first. Yes. A View from Tokyo, curated by Mark Godfrey, a beautifully hung space, references the experimental character of the 1970 Tokyo Biennial by exhibiting Japanese artists like Susumu Koshimitsu, along with Western artists who took part in the event and traveled to Japan, such as Carl Andre and Luciano Fabro. Although the works exhibited are not those that were represented in Tokyo, archival photographs propose a glimpse of the event. A View from Buenos Aires, curated by Tanya Barson, now at MACPA, displays artworks by artists associating in different ways to the Centro de Arte y Comunicación, created by Jorge Glusberg in Buenos Aires in '69. It presents pieces by artists like Luis Kamnitzer, Antonio Caro, Sildo Meireles, and Dora Mauer. Here you see it. Finally, A View from São Paulo is possibly the most problematic of these rooms because of the absence of key figures in concretism in São Paulo, such as Valdemar Cordeiro and Geraldo de Barros. In fact, the room presents work by artists of different nationalities that exhibited at the Biennial in the 50s. In reality, the key works in the space reference a common view of Brazilian art in international circles that concentrates on a few celebrated artists like Lydia Clark, Eloy Tisica, Ligia Pape, and Mira Schendl. Without diminishing the great importance of the work of these artists, a more comprehensive view of concrete art would certainly be interesting and appropriate. Furthermore, as opposite to other rooms of the same genre, A View from São Paulo privileges notions of genealogy that tie together different temporalities. Thus, Lydia Clark's Bichot stands between a Mondrian and a Léger. Clark studied with Léger in Paris in the 50s. The connection between Brazilian and British artists is proposed but not explored, as documentation in Vitrine displays the Neo-Concrete Manifesto and a bulletin from Signals Gallery in London. Sorry, these are more images, and this is the Vitrine, an association that refers more to the 1960s than to the 1950s. Beyond these specific questions, I would say that the module A View From is a significant variation in Tate thematic's display of the collection. On one hand, through the articulation of art historical perspective, it complicates and thus implicitly problematizes the more intuitive thematic and formal association in the whole display. In this sense, it stimulates a questioning of the relation between the museum's display strategy and art historical scholarship. On the other hand, it proposes a view of modernity that highlights the importance of off-center centers like São Paulo and Tokyo. In this sense, it proposes to explore international moments of exchange between artists since the 1950s as a prefiguration of the connectedness of contemporary art in the present. As observed by Terry Smith, I quote, complexity within modernity itself laid the background for the diversity that we now see flowing through the present, end quote. But that's the module A View From managed to provincialize European and North American art. Not really, I would say, but its tentative character, its partial failures in this sense, and its lack of historical contextualization that would allow for a more multi-layered reading promises in a more positive way future developments in new direction that would allow for experimentation and heterogeneity in the museum. In the last few years, discussions around the idea of the global museums have developed broadly in different contexts, as attested by diverse projects such as the global collaboration at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam and the program Global Museum of the German Federal Cultural Foundation. Symposia and conferences like Collecting Geographies in 2014 in Amsterdam, and more recently, the idea of the Global Museum at Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin in December 2016, created significant platform for exploring the problems and possibilities associated with museums' engagement in the global turn. In the conference at Hamburger Bahnhof in December, Patrick Flores, professor and curator based in Manila, Philippines, interestingly claimed for an interaction between a grounded globality and an extensive locality. In a similar form, in CIMAM's 2009 annual conference in Mexico, titled Fair Trade, Natalia Maslov, director of the Museum of Art in Lima, Peru, explored questions related to the locality of culture confronting the global market. I quote, "In less than 2 decades, we have seen a radical transformation in the piercing of the modernist canon and its paradigm of development as a result of both an increasingly globalized market and the sustained efforts of Latin American collectors in the United States and more recently in Europe. Yet," I'm still quoting, "the inclusion we fought for was necessary and it was blind to the consequences of what it proposed. Although in the process we forgot the sites of production, the locality of culture and the place of institutions like museums in the new field of production and exchange," end quote. The engagement of local artists with the international market often translates, in fact, as observed by Maslov, in an increase of prices that prevents local institutions from acquiring artworks from local artists who enter the international market. I quote again, "Added to the modernist dream of a universal language of art, we now have a global dream of a new kind of contemporary survey museum that can claim to collect the world. And we know that not all of us can collect the world. The Wilfredo lamp that the MoMA may no longer hang in the clock room, but they are certainly not hanging in many Latin American museums," end quote. What is the impact of the global art market and of a global collecting by museums like Tate and MoMA that benefit from support by many private donors and patrons on local institutions? Certainly, the local consequences are complex, and possibly not all of them are negative. In the view of Mexican curator Cuauhtémoc Medina, I quote, "The involvement of elites in institutions worldwide is one of the key elements of the inclusion of Southern art in the global canon. Their economic contribution, more than our theoretical discourses, have succeeded in undermining the monopoly of the account of modernism and the unidirectionality of culture. Even so, it is undeniable that the contribution of Southern elites to central institutions implies a strengthening of the center's actual centrality. It is still an expression of dependent capitalism," end quote. If museums such as Tate do not engage in this sort of questioning, they fail to fully commit to the transnational agenda that they openly set for themselves. For besides the ownership of artworks and the inclusion of pieces from many different regions of the world in their collections, transnationality should also be problematized from an ethical perspective as a form of working together as curators and museum professionals based in different geographical, cultural, and political contexts, shaping strategic alliances to share knowledge and to share economic resources. If failing to do so, the global, devoid of political substance and criticality, becomes just another form of branding, as Julian Salabras would put it, or, in the words of Terry Smith, the museum search for, I quote, "competitive edge as centers of attraction within spectacle culture," end quote.
Well, thank you, Giulia. I think we still have time just for 1 or 2 questions, so I would ask Pedro, Jesús, and Evanthia to please join us back at the table. And I would immediately ask if someone would like to share some thoughts on these presentations or ask a question. No? Not at all? So I'm going to ask one myself, just to close this debate. I think that these presentations had a lot of recurrent questions among them, and we all noticed the tensions between the local and the global, between the social and pedagogical responsibility of institutions and the pressures that they also have to respond to regarding tourism, regarding cultural policies and politics, even regarding the markets and so on. But considering this last presentation and going back to one question that our first keynote speaker asked Ferran Barrenbilt, he was saying that currently the big museums are no more seen as a threat because of the fragmentation of the canon. And your perspective on Tate's position regarding this effort to expand actually made me think if this form of expansion is not actually a reinforcement of the threat instead of being something else. I think this question could actually be productive regarding all the papers, and I think we could jointly discuss it. Would you like to start, Giulia, taking into consideration that you just presented something that goes directly into this issue?
Yes, I think that Tate has been acquiring these works for the last 10 years, more even for many collections, and now has acquired, has a very rich collection and a group of curators that are very specialized in many areas. But as our keynote speaker said, for me, what is important is not just the what, but the how. I think this is a key question. So I think that the question of shaping, different histories of modernism and contemporary art is still very relevant, and I think that an institution like Tate, if it manages, as it is trying to do, to find space for experimentation and also for failure, it will actually maybe produce a very interesting program in this sense. I think also that the institution is actually questioning itself very much. So now we have acquired all these works, but what is the kind of art historical canon that we use to reflect on these works? Through which lenses are we looking at these works? But I also think that how working together, how these works are taken from their context and brought into another context is very important. What happens to local institutions? What happens to education in places? What happens in places in which the global market is very strong because there is not state protection of certain heritage, for example? I think that is a kind of, because states still occupy such a strongly symbolic place, it is really a very strong responsibility to reflect about this.
Yes, would you like to add some ideas, Evanthia? Or Pedro and Jesús, of course.
I think based on the theme or in the perspectives of seeing Greece in relation to Germany, because this is my experience, again, it's very diverse. So, for example, what is the strategy, because there is a strategy also from the Greek institutions. There was and there is. There are different kind of directors that passed by. There are different kind of ideas, a different kind of discourse. In Greece, they have collections, for example, but these collections, they don't have many opportunities to show them. So they collect. Okay, thank you. So they collect and there is not so much to see from the collected works, which is completely the opposite in Germany. It's very, very interesting to see that somehow it's very diverse, I will say, because they have a different strategy, they have a different politics. Germany is a country where after the Second World War, many allies invested and rebuilt it, so they have a great privilege and the great luxury to be able to invest, to have cultural politics and policies which Greece cannot have, doesn't have the money and doesn't have the culture for that can sustain. They cannot plan for something which will, they cannot understand that if they plan something now, they can have the results after 10 years, 20 years. This is not possible in Greece, but it is possible in Germany, and And we all know that if we don't plan in advance, we are not going to have anything as a result. And the question is how to plan in advance. I mean, under which conditions can one agree with different kind of entities inside a society or a community to say, okay, we agree, we have to agree on something. It's, we are obliged somehow to agree, otherwise things will float. And in times like today, where we think we see an enormous acceleration of changes, that we are confronted with things that we think we cannot control, which I think it's not true. We can somehow contribute in that, and I'm talking about the side of the artist who is the weaker in all these people, all these entities, all these identities we are concerned. So the weaker part still has, I believe, and therefore I keep on working, not only as an artist, but also initiating projects. I think we should at least try not to give up to that, and I think somehow we have to invent something which would be not like appropriating the others' appearances, strategies, or whatever, but we have to invent somehow our own position in that, which comes from our experience, which comes from our own wishes, our own necessities, and our own vision. I will say vision, but in a substantial way of what we want, what kind of future do we want, really, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Which leads us to that idea of breathing together and conspiracy. Yes.
Well, going back to the how, I have the impression that maybe the global paradigm is over. I mean, the paradigm of the global museum was somehow furnishing the new world order that opened up in 1989, and somehow, if you think of the current situation in the world, that paradigm is probably just a kind of curtain or a mirage that is hiding something much more violent. So probably we should actually ask ourselves whether the paradigm that somehow the Tate is being leading is about to collapse because of the possibility of showing in the same rooms works by Iranian, Syrian or French artists that couldn't be as evident as it was just 10 years ago. So, I mean, we should bear in mind that all these words, paradigms we've been developing our institutions within may not be continuous. So I have the impression that we have to think of it seriously. And there's all kind of things the global paradigm has been hiding, very different kind of operations, and some of them are nice or interesting, some of them are not, or some of them are more contradictory than others. I remember in Reina Sofia when I was working, especially I think it was around 2013, there were two exhibitions simultaneously, or not simultaneously but nearly overlapping. One was, and they had to do with the metropolitan position that Spain still wants to have within the Latin American world. There was a collection of neo-concrete or concrete art, part of the Patricia Phelps de Cisneros collection. Is one of the most important collectors of Latin American art in the world. And for the Reina Sofia was a way to connect with the big guys. Well, in the case, the big women. Because collectors in Latin American art tend to be women, because they are, well, that's a long story. But the thing is, on the one hand, we were having this very, very neat exhibition of these very neat pieces of art, some of them somehow betraying the intentions of people like Ligia Kak. And then on the other hand, we had another exhibition that was part of a long-term negotiation with our collective that is called the Red Conceptualismos del Sur, Southern conceptualism network, that is a new institutional collective that is being challenging the way metropolitan museums collect and appropriate and expropriate works of art. The way that some of these pieces came to our museum had to do with somehow a retrieval from the accumulation impulse of the institution. For instance, some of the works that we have of that period of the conceptualist Latin American art of the 60s, 70s, and 80s doesn't belong to anybody. So a museum that is covering pieces which escape the property definition, and that was extremely challenging to reconsider the notion of heritage and the word heritage or common heritage. So we had both things overlapping. On the one hand, the global as expressed with the collection of a Venezuelan exiled rich collector, at the same time as having an exhibition that had to do with political negotiation with the recognition of the authority of others, whoever they are, and an exhibition not based on property. So the house are important, and that probably they are the most important. And the thing is that if we recognize that this globalization paradigm is about to be over, how can we conspire to build another kind of internationality? And I think that probably Frank could have speak about the project of La Internationale that was is being always the alternative, at least it saw itself as the alternative to the Tate model. No?
Yes.
So, but I think we are more interested to think about it.
Thank you, Jesus. Pedro, any final remarks? We don't have much time, but it would be
yes,
nice
just very little. I'm talking also from opposite point of view. I try to do it in my intervention from a museum like Tate, where this idea of collecting and global collecting is so clear. In the case I was talking about it was even the own idea of collecting was imposed, was a kind of challenge or put in doubt. I think that also had to do with all these trends of new institutionalism of the early 2000s that we went through, especially in Spain, when there was a little bit of inexperience with some things, and sometimes debates got to positions where we probably challenge or question the role of the museum, even sometimes I would say too much, in the sense of unfocusing the main purpose of the museum, which is collect. And what we do collect and how we do collect, of course, that's up to discussion. But the idea of collecting, of creating a collection, a group of art pieces, whatever the nature and mediums of these art pieces are, and the way of creating a memory, and of course opposing discourses out of these collections is important. But at some points it came into its discussion. This very simple notion that came into discussion because museums have to be schools, have to be laboratories, and I am totally 100% in favor of that, but I think we should in a way also kind of redefine this very essential notion of the museum, which is collecting, and what does it mean to collect today. And I think artists face us into very poignant questions of what is collecting today. And I think in this exhibition that I was talking about, an artist making a work out of a letter that she didn't own. It was a very precious non-artistic document only owned by a person in the city of Vigo. What does this kind of art production address to the museum in the 21st century, or other artists working with other kind of immaterial positions? So I think this is another important point from the point of view of collecting, and I think also Jesus was getting into this field in the end of his intervention now, with the idea of also if we can collect artworks of different natures, especially after conceptual art and material artworks, then we can probably share them.
right? So probably that's another question that we should talk about.
Thank you. Well, I'm really sorry for finishing this discussion, but we really have to keep track of time, and it's already lunchtime. So I really hope that during the afternoon we can extend this discussion. And I would kindly ask you to be here at 2:30, please. Thank you. And thank you all for all your presentations, of course.